The murder of Laci Peterson is a unique tragedy. The media heavily covered the case, and due to the turn of the century, the internet was on the rise, causing this case to be able to spread further than ever before. Even though the crime was committed over 21 years ago, there have been updates to this case as recently as this year. Here's what happened in Modesto, California on December 24th, 2002, as told by Scott Peterson, Laci's husband. They both got up on the morning of December 24th, and Scott was getting ready to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. He said Laci was watching a Martha Stewart show, and he remembered something about meringue being mentioned. He had also said that he knew Laci was going to go walk their dog. Scott stops at his office to check his email on the way to the marina, and he also has a receipt from the marina at 12:45 p.m. He goes out on the water for about 2 hours and returns home that afternoon. He finds the dog with his leash still on in the backyard. A neighbor had put the dog there because she was running around loose with no sign of Laci. Scott called his mother-in-law, Sharon, to ask if Laci was with her, and when they found out she wasn't, they reported Laci missing. On January 17, 2003, it became known to the public that Scott had an ongoing affair with a woman named Amber Frey. It was Amber who came forward to the police on December 30th when she learned that Scott was a suspect in Laci's disappearance. She told police that she had met Scott on November 20th, and he had told her he was single. She also told police that on December 9th, Scott had told her that his wife had died, and it would be his first Christmas without a wife.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Okay.
You haven't been watching the news, obviously.
No.
I've lied to you when I've been traveling.
Okay.
The girl I got married to, she disappeared just before Christmas.
Scott, you told me you'd lost your wife and this was the first holidays you'd spend without her?
On April 13, 2003, a couple walking their dog found the decomposing body of a full-term male infant on the San Francisco Bay shore. 1 day later, a passerby found the body of a recently pregnant woman 1 mile from where the baby's body was found. The corpse was almost unrecognizable as a human, lacking a head or arms and the majority of her legs. On April 18th, DNA testing was done and confirmed the bodies to be Laci and her unborn sons. Detectives have previously put a tracker on Scott's car because he had plans to go to San Diego. This was very near the border, and they suspected he might be trying to flee. He was found on April 18th and arrested near the golf course he was planning to attend. He had dyed his hair and was carrying $15,000 of cash on him, along with camping gear, survival equipment, 4 cell phones, and 2 driver's licenses. The trial began on June 1st and was very messy. The prosecution's story involved Scott killing Laci the night before, on the 23rd, and then dumping her in the marina the next morning. This story is later debunked because Laci called her mom on the morning of the 24th, around 8:30. And the Martha Stewart show that Scott said she was watching also did contain meringue, like Scott had mentioned when he was initially questioned. There were also searches on the household computer involving sunflower umbrellas and women's clothes. This destroyed the prosecution's timeline, but the problem was the defense didn't have much evidence in favor of Scott. The prosecution came up with stronger evidence, such as the motive could have been that he wanted a relationship with Amber, the evidence being their phone calls that were recorded without Scott's knowledge. Scott had lied to Amber about being in Paris instead of in Modesto. He also failed to attend Laci's candlelight vigil, and 2 relatives of Laci said Scott had not shown enough emotion during Laci's disappearance. Another thing that was brought up was that Scott had dyed his hair and also purchased a vehicle using his mother's name. And a realtor testified that in January 2003, Scott expressed interest in selling his and Laci's house, all things pointing to Scott wanting to leave or disappear. On November 12, 2004, Scott was convicted of 2 counts of murder, the first being first-degree murder with special circumstances for Laci, and the second being second-degree murder of killing the baby she was carrying. On March 16th, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. It is also important to mention that in August 2020, the Supreme Court of California upheld Scott's conviction but overturned his death sentence because Scott's court judge wrongfully dismissed jurors who opposed the death penalty without asking for them to set aside their beliefs first, still leaving Scott with life in prison. As recently as March of this year, the LA Innocence Project posted a hearing for Scott because they had accepted his case 2 months prior for new evidence from the trial. The Innocence Project said it supported Scott's innocence. This new evidence was DNA evidence, but in April 2024, the prosecution said it was unnecessary because Scott lied during the trial and DNA testing was already done in 2013 and 2019. In my own opinion, I do think that Scott's motive for this crime was heavily influenced by his ongoing affair with Amber Frey. The biggest reason of all being before Laci was murdered, he told Amber that his wife was dead, which I think shows that he was planning to kill her for at least those 2 weeks beforehand, if not longer. I also think the lack of other suspects is a big factor in determining Scott's guilt.
The problem, once again, came back to the bodies washed up where he said he was.
The reality is, he was fishing on top of her body. All right, you want to call that a coincidence? Fine, have at it.
Pertaining to archetypes, I think the show wanted to display that there were multiple victims of this crime, not just Laci like the title may suggest. Other victims include their unborn son, and could also include Amber Frey, who had no idea that Scott had a wife. It also could include the family of everyone, and I think the show did a good job at showing how hurt these two individuals' families were.
People of the state of California versus Scott Peterson, we the jury in the above entitled cause fix the penalty at death.
I've been praying for justice. That's what I said before the verdict was read. I know that millions of people have been praying for justice. I think this is justice.
That day was probably the lowest point in my life.
The media is brought up again and again in the show.
We're 2 weeks into this case. No body, no evidence of time, place, or manner of the killing, and the media is all over you about it. So you try to prove the case against Scott Peterson through the media as quickly as possible.
The prosecutors and the police have an enormous advantage over the defense because they have information that they could leak to reporters, and oftentimes the defense doesn't know about that information.
There were constantly headlines, sources say, and there's leaks and information saying that there's forensic evidence in the home. We don't have those police reports. You know, Scott didn't have them, we didn't have them, so we couldn't go refute that.
While there were official detectives on the case, I think the media played a more important detective role. This case was highly televised, and people generally went along with whatever the media said. People found out the information at the same time as the detectives and families did. A lot of people seem emotionally involved in this case, and not just from an entertainment perspective. People wanted justice for Laci, as shown by the community efforts of Modesto. People also disliked Scott a lot.
And so I started to look for public discussion forums. Those were becoming all the rage back then. But it was very unpleasant. If you thought Scott was innocent, you were in love with him, you supported a murderer, there could not be an intelligent discussion.
One of the reasons this case is important is because it led to a new act known as the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, which makes it so if an embryo or fetus in utero is injured or killed, then it's considered an additional person in the eyes of the court. It is worth noting that in this act there is a provision that explicitly says abortion is not included. The media covering this case was huge. It reached nationwide press coverage. Even though Scott was sentenced as guilty, the negative opinion of Scott in the media, in addition to him lacking evidence, gave the defense a much harder time, rather than if the situation had not been publicly known.
He was convicted in the public's eye long before we hit the trial.